Hey guys. Tonight take a breath. Lower the screen brightness. Maybe put the phone face down on the nightstand in a few minutes. Because we're easing into one of those history topics that sounds inspiring on paper, but gets extremely uncomfortable the moment you look too closely. Explorers. You know the type. Men with maps that were mostly guesses. Ships that leaked constantly. And an unshakable confidence that the world existed primarily for them to bump into it, plant a flag, and immediately cause long-term problems. So tonight we're not doing heroic discovery. No swelling music. No bold visionaries pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. Instead, we're gently drifting through the lives of the most dangerous explorers in history. Dangerous not because they fought monsters or survived storms, but because everywhere they went, things got worse. For the locals. For their crews. Sometimes for entire continents. And we'll do this slowly. Only. With the appropriate level of historical side-eye. So get comfortable. Because we begin, naturally, with a man who thought he was going to Asia, and instead accidentally rewrote global history in the messiest way possible. Christopher Columbus did not set out to be dangerous, which, historically, is often the most dangerous kind of person. He was born in Genoa sometime in the mid-15th century, which already tells you a lot. This was a time when maps were vague suggestions, hygiene was optional, and everyone believed the ocean was either infinite or actively hostile. Columbus grew up obsessed with the sea. He read travel accounts, studied navigation, and developed a deep, unwavering belief that he was smarter than everyone else in the room. This belief would carry him far, mostly in the wrong direction. By the time he reached adulthood, Columbus had convinced himself that Asia was much closer than anyone else thought. Not slightly miscalculated. More like entire oceans shorter. Every mathematician who checked his numbers told him he was wrong. Only. Repeatedly. With charts. Columbus responded by ignoring them completely. Eventually, after being rejected by multiple European courts, because even by 15th century standards his plan sounded reckless, he finally convinced Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon to fund his voyage. This alone was a red flag. In 1492, Columbus sailed west with 3 ships, a crew that trusted him far more than they should have, and an absolute refusal to consider that he might be wrong. When he reached land in the Caribbean, Columbus did not pause to reassess his calculations. He simply announced he had reached Asia, and then doubled down. The islands were obviously not Asia. The people didn't resemble anyone described in Asian travel accounts. The languages were unfamiliar. The geography made no sense. Columbus responded to all of this by declaring the locals Indians, because he was committed to the bit. This is where the danger really starts. Columbus wasn't just lost. He was authoritative while lost, which is history's favorite recipe for disaster. He immediately began claiming land, demanding gold, and enforcing brutal labor systems on the indigenous populations. People who had not invited him, had not threatened him, and were now being introduced to European diseases, violence, and exploitation at record speed. Columbus believed enslavement was efficient. He shipped people back to Europe as curiosities and laborers. Most did not survive the journey. Even his own crew suffered under his leadership. He ruled the colonies with paranoia, cruelty, and frequent punishments. Executions happened. Limbs were cut off. All in the name of maintaining order in a place he fundamentally did not understand. Eventually, reports of his behavior made it back to Spain. Columbus was arrested. In chains. By the same crown that had funded him. Which is impressive because monarchs of that era did not arrest you unless you were truly out of line. He was later released. He never admitted wrongdoing. And he died still convinced he had reached Asia. Columbus didn't just discover land. He unleashed systems that devastated entire populations. Not because he was uniquely evil for his time, but because he was ambitious, stubborn, and given unchecked authority. A dangerous combination, especially when paired with boats. And speaking of boats, let's float gently forward to someone who actually knew where he was going, and still managed to be catastrophic. Ferdinand Magellan was, in many ways, Columbus's opposite. Magellan was competent, highly trained, detail-oriented, and deeply, quietly ruthless. Born in Portugal, Magellan spent years serving the Portuguese crown in Asia. He learned navigation properly. He understood trade routes. He knew how empires worked, which meant when he felt undervalued by his king, he did the mature thing. He switched sides. Magellan offered his services to Spain, proposing a westward route to the Spice Islands that would conveniently bypass Portuguese control. Spain loved this idea, not because it was safe, but because it was petty. In 1519, Magellan set sail with 5 ships and about 270 men. His goal was to reach the East Indies by going west, something no one had successfully done. Unlike Columbus, Magellan did not underestimate the world. He just underestimated how miserable it would be. The voyage was long, painfully long. Food rotted. Water turned green. Crew members mutinied. Magellan responded to mutiny with calm decisiveness. He executed some men, stranded others, and made it very clear that dissent would not be tolerated. Eventually, the expedition reached the southern tip of South America and passed through what is now known as the Strait of Magellan. This alone would have secured his place in history. But Magellan wasn't done. He crossed the Pacific Ocean, an ocean no European had crossed before. The journey took months longer than expected. The crew ate leather. They chewed sawdust. They died of scurvy while Magellan insisted everything was fine. When they finally reached the Philippines, Magellan could have rested. Instead, he decided to involve himself in a local conflict. 'Cause of course he did. Magellan believed European weapons and armor made him invincible. He joined a battle to support a local ruler, underestimated the opposition, and was killed in combat, on a beach, far from home. After surviving the impossible, only one ship from his original fleet returned to Spain. Magellan himself did not complete the circumnavigation of the globe. And in the process, it proved that the world was larger, harsher, and less forgiving than Europe had imagined. Magellan's danger wasn't accidental. It was methodical. He enforced discipline through fear. He pushed his crew beyond reasonable limits. And he inserted himself into foreign power struggles with absolute confidence. The kind of confidence that ends badly. Let's drift onward now. From open oceans to dense jungles. From navigation to conquest. Because the next explorer didn't just map new lands. He dismantled civilizations. And somehow still thought he was the hero of the story. Take a breath. We'll continue slowly. Part 2. The lawyer who accidentally toppled an empire. Alright, let's keep drifting. No sudden movements. No dramatic music swelling in the background. Just another gentle slide into a historical situation that went off the rails almost immediately. Because next up is a man who proves, once again, that you do not need a royal title to cause irreversible global damage. You just need ambition, sword, and a truly unshakable belief that you are the main character. Hernán Cortés did not look like an explorer. He wasn't rugged in the storybook sense. He didn't come from ancient nobility. He didn't even start out particularly impressive. Cortés was trained as a lawyer, which historically is already ominous. He was born in Spain in the late 15th century, sickly as a child, restless as a young man, and deeply dissatisfied with the idea of living a quiet life. Spain at the time was riding high on overseas expansion. The Americas had been discovered, which in European terms meant aggressively entered and immediately exploited. Cortés went to the Caribbean first. He learned how colonial systems worked. He learned how violence was justified. And he learned, most importantly, that wealth went to people who acted first and apologized later. In 1519, Cortés organized an expedition to mainland Mexico, technically without proper authorization, which he solved by leaving before anyone could stop him. When he landed, Cortés did something that sounds symbolic but was actually extremely practical. He burned his ships. Not metaphorically. Literally. This ensured that no one could leave. And no one could question him. Which tells you everything you need to know about his leadership style. Cortés marched inland toward the heart of the Aztec Empire, a civilization of millions with cities larger than anything in Europe. Along the way, he encountered communities that were already under Aztec rule. Some resented it. Cortés noticed this immediately. He wasn't just an explorer. He was a political opportunist with excellent timing. By forming alliances with discontented groups, Cortés built a coalition. Not a Spanish army. Local one. And then he walked into the capital city, Tenochtitlan. The Aztec emperor, Moctezuma II, greeted Cortés peacefully. This decision has been debated for centuries. Some say Moctezuma believed Cortés was divine. Others argue he was trying diplomacy first. Either way, it did not go well. Cortés took Moctezuma hostage. In his own palace. While smiling politely. This is where Cortés becomes truly dangerous. Not just to others but to reality itself. He ruled through manipulation, fear, and misinformation. He exploited cultural misunderstandings. He introduced European diseases that tore through the population faster than any weapon. Smallpox alone devastated entire cities. Eventually, the situation collapsed into violence. The Spanish were driven out during a brutal retreat known as La Noche Triste. Many drowned under the weight of stolen gold. Cortés survived. Of course he did. He regrouped, returned, and laid siege to Tenochtitlan. When it finally fell, the city was destroyed. The empire collapsed, and Spanish colonial rule took its place. Cortés reported all of this back to Spain as a glorious victory. He was rewarded, then gradually sidelined, because crowns tend to get nervous around men who act independently and succeed. Cortés died wealthy, frustrated, and still convinced history owed him more. Which, to be fair, it gave him plenty. Cortés was dangerous because he understood systems. He didn't just explore geography. He explored weaknesses. And once he found them, he applied pressure until something broke. Let's drift onward again. From Mexico to South America. Where another man looked at an empire and decided to do even worse with fewer resources. Francisco Pizarro was not impressive on paper. He was illiterate, born out of wedlock, raised poor, which may explain why he spent his entire life trying to prove something. Pizarro had heard stories of immense wealth in the south, an empire rich in gold, an emperor worshipped as divine. The Inca Empire was real, and it was vast. By the time Pizarro arrived, the empire was already weakened by civil war and disease. Again, smallpox arrived first. Europeans followed later. Pizarro brought fewer than 200 men, which should not have been enough. But history is rarely fair. Through deception, ambush, and superior weaponry, Pizarro captured the Inca emperor, Atahualpa. Atahualpa offered a ransom room filled with gold and silver. Pizarro accepted, then executed him anyway, because consistency was not his strength. The conquest of the Inca Empire followed. Cities fell. Temples were stripped. Local populations were forced into labor systems that shattered their societies. Pizarro became governor, then was murdered by rivals, which feels narratively appropriate. Pizarro was dangerous not because he planned brilliantly, but because he acted ruthlessly in moments of instability. He arrived at the exact wrong time for everyone else. And now, let's slow the pace even further. Because our next explorer didn't conquer empires, didn't topple civilizations. He just disappeared into the wilderness, taking dozens of people with him, and somehow managed to become legendary anyway. Let's gently wander into the unknown next. Part 3. The Arctic, the canned food, and the slowest bad decision imaginable. Alright, settle back in. Nothing loud is about to happen. Just a very long, very cold sequence of choices that, in hindsight, maybe should have been reconsidered around minute one. Because now we arrive at an explorer whose danger wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, frozen, and sealed inside tins. Sir John Franklin was, by all outward appearances, a respectable man. Polite, well-connected, knighted, trusted by the British Admiralty, which historically means people stopped asking follow-up questions. Franklin had already survived multiple Arctic expeditions. He had nearly starved. He had eaten boiled leather. At one point, his men had resorted to cannibalism. And after all of this, Franklin concluded that the Arctic was still a great place to go back to. In 1845, Franklin was given command of an expedition to find the Northwest Passage, a navigable sea route through the Arctic connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This had been Europe's obsession for centuries. Franklin set out with 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Already, the names were doing a lot of heavy lifting. The ships were stocked with advanced technology for the time. Steam engines, reinforced hulls, and thousands of cans of preserved food. This was modern exploration. Confident, industrial, absolutely sure it had solved nature. The expedition sailed into the Arctic, and then vanished. No messages, no survivors, just silence. Years passed. Search parties were sent. Clues were slowly uncovered. And the picture that emerged was uncomfortably mundane. Franklin's ships became trapped in ice. Not dramatically, just gradually. They sat there, frozen, unable to move. Franklin himself died early into the ordeal, of unknown causes, which left his men stranded without their figurehead. The crew abandoned the ships and attempted to walk south, cross ice, in heavy uniforms, dragging boats. They never made it. Later examinations of remains revealed something deeply unsettling. The canned food had been improperly sealed. Lead from the solder had poisoned the crew over time. They were starving, disoriented. Some resorted to cannibalism. Again, the Franklin expedition became legendary, not because of discovery but because of absence. Nothing exploded. No single moment of catastrophe. Just a slow erosion of human endurance in a place that does not care. Franklin was dangerous because he trusted technology more than environment. Because he believed preparation was the same as control. The Arctic disagreed. Let's drift on now. Away from ice. Back toward heat. Toward a man who believed the interior of Africa could be neatly solved with a notebook and optimism. and who caused an enormous amount of suffering while trying. Henry Morton Stanley is remembered for one line. "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" which is charming, polite, and distracts beautifully from everything else. Stanley was not a gentleman. He was born poor, endured a brutal childhood, and learned early that survival meant domination. By the time he began exploring Africa, he had internalized a worldview where force was simply efficiency. Stanley was tasked with mapping the Congo River basin. This involved dense jungle, complex societies, and geography Europeans barely understood. Stanley's approach was simple: move forward, no matter what. Villages that resisted were punished. Porters were whipped. People were executed as examples. Stanley justified everything as necessary progress. His reports helped enable the establishment of the Congo Free State under King Leopold II, which would go on to become one of the most brutal colonial regimes in history. Stanley didn't personally run the Congo Free State, but his explorations made it possible. He opened the door. Others walked through with unspeakable cruelty. Stanley was dangerous because he reduced people to obstacles. And obstacles, in his mind, were meant to be removed. We're almost at the end of our list. Just one more explorer to gently unravel. This one didn't disappear, didn't freeze, didn't conquer empires outright. He circled the globe, mapped coastlines, and still managed to leave devastation behind. So let's ease into our final figure. Slowly, only. Because history's most dangerous explorers weren't monsters. They were confident men, given resources, authority, and just enough success to keep going. And that's where things usually fall apart. Part 4. The polite navigator who changed everything anyway. Alright, let's finish this the same way we started. Slow breathing. Low energy. No heroic music swelling in the background. Because our final explorer is often remembered as calm, scientific, and reasonable, which makes him especially unsettling once you sit with the long-term consequences. James Cook was not loud. He didn't rant about destiny. He didn't burn ships. He didn't topple empires in a single dramatic moment. He measured things. Cook was born in 1728 in England to a modest family. No aristocratic shortcuts. No dramatic prophecies. He joined the Navy late, worked his way up slowly, and became known for something rare among explorers: competence. Cook mapped coastlines with obsessive precision. He calculated longitude accurately. He enforced hygiene on his ships, which drastically reduced scurvy. In short, he was the kind of leader everyone trusted. Which is where the danger quietly begins. Cook's voyages were officially scientific. Chart the Pacific. Observe astronomical events. Expand knowledge. Unofficially, they were deeply imperial. On his first voyage, Cook mapped New Zealand and the eastern coast of Australia. He claimed the land for Britain with minimal ceremony. This wasn't conquest in the Cortés sense. No immediate collapse. Just flags. Paperwork. The kind that lasts forever. Cook encountered indigenous peoples across the Pacific. Sometimes peacefully. Sometimes not. At first, Cook tried diplomacy. But when misunderstandings happened, as they always did, he responded with force. Not out of rage. Out of procedure. Fire a warning shot. Escalate calmly. Restore order. Cook didn't see himself as cruel. He saw himself as reasonable, which history knows is far worse. His voyages introduced European diseases to isolated populations. Smallpox. Influenza. Things that spread invisibly, long after the ships left. Entire societies were destabilized without a single battle. Cook's final voyage brought him to Hawaii. At first he was treated as something divine, or at least symbolically significant. That didn't last. Tensions rose. Misunderstandings stacked up. Cook attempted to kidnap a local leader to force negotiations. A move that feels deeply off-brand for a man remembered as measured. He was killed on the beach in 1779. Quietly, abruptly, by people who had had enough. Cook was dangerous because he normalized expansion. He turned exploration into administration. Once Cook had mapped a place, empires followed. Settlers followed. Systems followed. And nothing ever returned to what it had been. So those were our 5. Not monsters. Not villains twirling mustaches. Just men with ships, resources, and confidence. Enough confidence to reshape the world without asking permission. And that, historically, is all it takes. Now let the mind drift. Let the details blur together. Ships sliding across dark water. Maps being redrawn. Consequences unfolding slowly over centuries. Because history rarely ends with explosions. It usually ends with paperwork. And silence. Good night. Part 5. The extra ones who probably should have stayed home. Alright. We're not done yet. History almost never stops neatly where it's supposed to. So instead of waking you up with a hard ending, we'll just keep drifting. Because once you start looking at dangerous explorers, you realize something uncomfortable. There are a lot of them. So think of this as the long, slow epilogue. The part where the lights are already dim, the brain is half asleep, and history just keeps mumbling quietly in the background. Let's gently meet a few more people who made the world objectively worse, while insisting they were being helpful. Vasco da Gama is often praised as a maritime genius. And yes, technically he was. He found a sea route from Europe to India. A direct connection that reshaped global trade forever. Unfortunately, he also brought along something extra. Violence, religious hostility, and a complete lack of chill. Da Gama's voyages to the Indian Ocean were not diplomatic. They were armed, aggressive, and deeply cruel. He attacked Muslim trading ships. He bombarded port cities. At one point, he captured a ship full of pilgrims, including women and children, and burned it at sea. Alive. Which feels like an important detail that often gets quietly skipped. Da Gama believed terror was an effective negotiating tool. And in the short term he wasn't wrong. Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean was built not just on navigation, but on fear. Trade routes were opened. Gunpoint. Da Gama died wealthy and respected. History labeled him an architect of globalization. The people who met him firsthand tended to remember him differently. Let's move inland now. Away from oceans. Toward deserts, heat, and long, uncomfortable marches. Because danger doesn't always arrive by ship. Marco Polo is often remembered as charming, curious, witted, a medieval travel blogger with better funding. And while Marco Polo wasn't violent in the same way as conquistadors, he was dangerous in a subtler way. He spent years traveling through Asia and returned to Europe with stories that sounded unbelievable. Cities bigger than anything Europeans had seen. Paper money. Advanced systems of governance. Many readers assumed he was exaggerating. But his accounts planted ideas. Europe became obsessed with the East. With wealth. With access. Polo didn't conquer anything himself. But his stories helped fuel the hunger that sent others outward. Sometimes danger isn't what you do. It's what you inspire. Now let's slow this down even more. Because our next figure wasn't dramatic. Wasn't violent. wasn't even particularly successful. He was just stubborn. Robert Falcon Scott went to Antarctica not because it made sense, but because it mattered to national pride. Scott wanted to be first. First to the South Pole. First to plant a flag. His planning was optimistic. He used ponies, which froze. He relied on motor sledges, which broke. When Scott finally reached the South Pole, he discovered that Roald Amundsen had arrived first. Weeks earlier, Scott and his team turned back. They never made it home. Their journals were found later. Measured. Quietly heartbreaking. Scott wasn't reckless in the Cortés sense. He wasn't cruel. But he was dangerous because he let pride outrun preparation. And nature noticed. At this point, the pattern should feel familiar. Explorers are rarely evil. They're rarely stupid. They are usually confident, backed by power, certain that movement forward is always progress. And history almost never corrects them in time. So as we gently wind down, let's zoom out just a little. Exploration reshaped the world. It connected continents. It expanded knowledge. And it also brought disease, slavery, environmental collapse, cultural erasure. Not because explorers set out to destroy everything, but because they were rewarded for not stopping, for not asking, for not turning back. And maybe that's the most dangerous thing of all. Now let the details blur. Names fading. Ships dissolving into dark water. Footsteps disappearing into snow, jungle, sand. History will still be there tomorrow. But for now, there's nowhere left to go. Good night. Part 6. When the map was full but they kept walking anyway. Alright, we'll keep the lights low. No sharp turns. Just one more slow stretch of history quietly talking to itself. Because even after the age of great exploration supposedly ended, people kept going, kept pushing, kept insisting there was something left to prove. And that's when exploration became less about discovery, and more about endurance, ego, and paperwork with flags on it. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, most coastlines were already mapped. The world was, inconveniently, starting to look complete, which made certain men extremely uncomfortable. So they turned inward, into interiors, deserts, holes, jungles, places where survival itself could still be marketed as achievement. And with that shift, danger changed shape. It wasn't always about what explorers did to others anymore. Sometimes it was about what they did to the people who trusted them enough to follow. David Livingstone is often remembered as gentle, anti-slavery, soft-spoken, deeply religious. And compared to Stanley, yes, Livingstone was practically a lullaby. But Livingstone also pushed deep into Central Africa with limited preparation, poor logistics, and a stubborn refusal to admit when things were going badly, which was often. He became ill repeatedly, lost contact with the outside world, and relied heavily on African guides whose names rarely made it into the official records. Livingstone didn't conquer, but his journeys opened routes. Routes others would later use for extraction, colonization, control. He meant well. History rarely cares. And then there were the explorers who weren't chasing land or trade. They were chasing firsts. The Poles became particularly popular for this. Blank. Hostile. Uninterested in human ambition. Perfect. Ernest Shackleton is often praised as the good kind of dangerous. A leader who failed heroically. His endurance expedition to Antarctica didn't reach its goal. The ship was crushed by ice. The crew was stranded. And yet, almost miraculously, everyone survived. Shackleton turned disaster into legend through leadership, empathy, and adaptability, which only highlights something important. Exploration didn't have to be destructive, but it required humility, and humility historically was in short supply. Most explorers were rewarded not for restraint, but for results, maps completed, routes secured, claims made. No one funded the expedition that stopped early because it felt wrong. And that brings us back to the quiet danger beneath all of this. The system. Explorers didn't operate alone. They were backed by crowns, companies, and governments. Every step forward came with expectations. Bring back information. Bring back profit. Bring back proof you were there. Consequences were someone else's problem. Usually later. Much later. If you zoom out far enough, the pattern softens. Ships become lines on charts. Names blur together. Dates lose their edges. What remains is motion. People moving into places already occupied. Already lived in. Already understood by someone else. And calling it discovery anyway. So when we say dangerous explorers, we don't really mean men who risked their lives. Almost all of them did that. We mean men whose movement created ripples that never stopped. Languages fading. Borders hardening. Ecosystems shifting. All from someone pointing at a horizon and saying, "Let's see what's over there." Now let the mind loosen its grip on the details. Names drift apart. Cold blends into heat. Oceans flatten into quiet darkness. Exploration doesn't end. Just becomes routine. Logged. Filed. And the world carries on rearranged. That's enough for tonight. No more maps. No more routes. No more confident footsteps forward. Just stillness. Good night. Part 7. The long quiet after the footsteps fade. Alright. We're still here. No alarms. No sudden conclusions. Just the slow, comfortable realization that history doesn't really end. Just lowers its voice. By now, the explorers have started to blur together. Ships overlap. Names soften. Cold seas feel strangely similar to hot deserts once enough time passes. And that's appropriate. Because the most dangerous part of exploration wasn't any single voyage. It was what came after. Long after the flags were planted and the journals were published, the consequences kept moving. Routes turned into supply lines. Supply lines turned into borders. Borders hardened. Explorers rarely stayed to manage the results. They moved on. Or died. Or retired into comfortable obscurity. The places they passed through did not get that luxury. Take the maps. Early maps were vague. Almost apologetic. Then explorers returned with measurements. Coordinates. Certainty. Once something was mapped, it was easier to claim. Once claimed, easier to extract from. Once extracted from, easier to forget. Danger didn't arrive with cannons every time. Sometimes it arrived as ink. There's a reason so many explorers wrote obsessively. Journals. Logs. Letters home. Writing was proof. Proof they had been there. Proof they mattered. And those writings shaped how entire continents were understood. Usually from a single, narrow perspective. A river became a route. A forest became a resource. Population became a statistic. No malice required. Just distance. If you listen closely, you can hear the same language repeat. Empty land. Untouched wilderness. Unclaimed territory. Which is fascinating considering people were already living there. Farming. Trading. Arguing. Raising children. But explorers didn't arrive looking for people. They arrived looking for purpose. And maybe that's the quietest danger of all. Exploration rewarded movement for its own sake. Forward became good. Stopping became failure. No one wrote ballads about turning back early. No statues were built to honor restraint. So explorers kept going. Even when it cost lives. Even when it destabilized regions. Even when it clearly wasn't helping anyone who lived there. By the 20th century, the age of exploration was supposedly over. The maps were full. The coastlines traced. Poles reached. But the mindset lingered. Corporations replaced caravels. Surveys replaced journals. Extraction replaced discovery. Same ocean. Different paperwork. And that's why these explorers were dangerous. Not because they were brave. Not because they endured hardship. But because they were part of a system that mistook movement for virtue. A system that asked, "Can we go there?" And rarely followed up with, "Should we?" Now let everything soften. The names dissolve first. Then the dates. Then even the ships themselves fade into vague silhouettes. All that's left is the idea of someone standing at the edge of the known world, convinced the unknown exists for them. History has seen that moment many times, and it has learned, slowly, quietly, that confidence is not the same as wisdom. That's enough for tonight. No more horizons. No more routes to follow. No more footsteps pressing into places that were never empty. Just darkness, stillness, and the gentle hum of a world that remembers. Good night. Part 8. The gentle loop back to the beginning. Alright, we'll stay right here a little longer. No need to move on yet. History is very good at filling silence if you let it. By now, everything should feel pleasantly distant. Like you're hearing these stories through a wall. Muffled. Often. Which is good. Because this is the part where history stops listing names. And starts repeating itself. If you rewind all the way back to the beginning of exploration, the motivation always sounds noble. Curiosity, faith, science, opportunity. But sitting underneath all of it is something simpler. Restlessness. A deep discomfort with staying put. Explorers were rarely content people. They were often dissatisfied, ambitious, or quietly afraid of being ordinary. So they moved. And because movement was expensive, dangerous, and highly visible, it was praised. No one asked what staying might have accomplished. There's a reason so many explorers came from societies already struggling with inequality, overcrowding, or political tension. Going outward solved problems temporarily. Fewer mouths at home. More resources elsewhere. New distractions. Exploration didn't fix systems. Postponed reckoning. And postponement historically is very attractive. If you look closely, most dangerous explorers weren't outliers. They were perfectly average products of their time. They believed. Their culture was superior. Their methods were efficient. Their intentions mattered more than outcomes. Which meant they didn't feel dangerous. They felt necessary. And that's why their stories were told the way they were. Trimmed, polished, redirected. Journals became adventure tales. Violence became pacification. Displacement became settlement. Language did the heavy lifting long after the ships were gone. Even today, the echoes are still there. We don't talk about who was discovered. We talk about who did the discovering. We celebrate firsts, not consequences. And the rhythm continues. If you're still awake, this is usually where the mind starts wandering. You might think about how quiet these stories actually are. No single moment where the world changed forever. Just thousands of small decisions stacking on top of each other. Sail anyway. March anyway. Map it anyway. History didn't collapse. Shifted. And then, people adapted. They always do. New borders became normal. New languages blended. New power structures solidified. The shock faded. The aftermath became background noise. Which is perhaps the most unsettling part. Dangerous exploration rarely looked dangerous in the moment. It looked organized, sponsored, proved. It wore uniforms, carried letters of authority, signed treaties no one local could read. And then it moved on. Now let the mind slow even more. Imagine the ocean without ships, the desert without footsteps, the forest without survey lines. Not as a fantasy, just as a pause. Because pauses are the one thing exploration never allowed itself. That's where we'll stay. In the pause. No more forward motion. No more need to prove anything. Just the quiet understanding that the world was never empty, and never needed conquering to exist. That's enough. Rest now. Part 9. When nothing new happens, and that's the point. Alright. We're deep into it now. The part of the night where time stops behaving properly. Where 10 minutes feels like an hour. And an hour feels like it never really happened. So this part doesn't introduce anyone new. No fresh names. No ships with ominous names. No flags being unfolded dramatically in the wind. Because by this point in the story, nothing new needs to happen. Most historical narratives are addicted to beginnings. The first voyage. The first landing. The first map. But danger rarely lives at the beginning. It settles in afterward. Quietly. Comfortably. After the explorer has gone home. After the journals are published. After the lectures are given to polite audiences who nod approvingly. That's when the real work begins. Think about how exploration was remembered. Statues went up. Paintings were commissioned. School books simplified everything into neat paragraphs. Man. Ship. Date. No footnotes about the families displaced. No long explanations about ecosystems disrupted. No careful accounting of how many people never had a say. Those details were inconvenient, so they were allowed to fade. And fading is powerful. Once something fades into the background, it stops feeling like a choice. It starts feeling like the way things have always been. Borders that began as guesses became permanent. Trade routes hardened into dependencies. Economic systems built on extraction learned to call themselves normal. All because someone once decided to keep going. What's interesting is how familiar this mindset still feels. Even now, movement is praised. Expansion is celebrated. Growth is treated like a moral good. Stopping still feels suspicious. Like failure. Like weakness. Explorers taught us that lesson very well. If you listen closely to their stories, you'll notice something else. Very few of them talk about satisfaction. They reached places, completed routes, achieved first, and then they planned the next expedition. There was always another horizon, another blank space on the map, another reason not to sit quietly with what they'd already done. Maybe that's why these stories work so well as bedtime listening. Because exploration is restless, and sleep is not. Sleep asks nothing of you. It doesn't reward ambition. It doesn't care how far you've gone. Just happens. So as the voices fade and the details soften even further, let the contrast settle in. All that movement, all that effort, all that disruption, and here you are, ill, breathing, not conquering anything. History will keep going without you for a while. Maps will stay drawn. Names will remain printed. Arguments will repeat themselves in quieter forms. You don't need to witness any of it tonight. If the mind reaches for another name, let it go. If it tries to connect dots, let them blur. Explorers spent their lives refusing to rest. You don't have to. That's the quiet victory they never learned how to achieve. No more parts after this one in any meaningful way. Just the slow, comfortable absence of forward motion. Good night. Part 10. The soft drift where even history gets tired. Alright. We'll keep going. But only barely. This is the part where the story doesn't really move anymore. Just breathes. Like the world itself has decided it's done explaining things for the night. By now, exploration has lost its edges. The danger isn't sharp, dull, worn smooth by repetition. Because once something has happened often enough, it stops feeling dramatic. Ship arrives. Flag is raised. A report is written. System changes. Repeat. After a while, even history stops reacting. Think about how rarely explorers talked about home. Not in any real way. Home was something to leave. Something too small. Too quiet. Too ordinary. They wrote thousands of words about rivers, coastlines, mountains, and almost nothing about stillness. Because stillness doesn't prove anything. There's something strangely exhausting about that. Always moving. Always measuring. Always claiming. Never asking what would happen if you just stayed. If you zoom out far enough, exploration becomes less about geography and more about temperament. Some people can sit with what exists. Others need to push against it. History tended to reward the second group, even when the results were catastrophic, especially then. And that's why these dangerous explorers keep reappearing in different centuries. Different flags, different ships, same impulse, a belief that motion is meaning. But meaning doesn't actually require distance. You don't need to cross oceans to leave an impact. You don't need to map anything to exist fully. Explorers rarely learn that lesson. Which is why their stories sound impressive. And oddly hollow. At some point the maps filled in. Not because everything was known. But because there was no space left to label unknown without discomfort. So the world became finished. And yet the restlessness remained. That restlessness didn't disappear. Just changed careers. Now let the mind stop following lines. No routes. No arrows. No dotted paths moving west or south or just a little farther. Only a flat, quiet moment. The ocean isn't crossed. The ice isn't challenged. The jungle isn't entered. They just exist. Perfectly fine without commentary. Explorers never trusted that. They always assumed something needed to be done. But tonight nothing does. So if your thoughts start to wander, let them. Not forward. Not outward. Just downward. Into that heavy, comfortable quiet. Where nothing is being proven. And no one is being remembered incorrectly. History can wait. It's been waiting for centuries already. Good night. All right. We've drifted through oceans, jungles, deserts, and ice. We've lingered over maps, journals, and flags. And now, if you're still awake, it's time for the softest, quietest ending. Because the most dangerous explorers weren't just people who moved. They weren't always cruel or reckless in the obvious ways. Their danger was subtler. It was in motion itself. Think of the horizon. It is always the same distance away. No matter how far you walk. No matter how fast your ship sails. It recedes politely, endlessly. Explorers treated it like a challenge. As if reaching it could change the world. Or themselves. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it only changed maps. Sometimes it changed nothing at all except the weariness of the feet that carried them. By the late 19th century, exploration had shifted again. From empires to scientists. From flags to photographs. From conquest to measurement. Yet the same patterns remained. Leave home. Travel far. Record everything. Return if you could. Influence people who never saw the journey firsthand. Danger, in this sense, became quiet. It was the slow reshaping of lives, societies, and landscapes. Almost imperceptible at first. Yet enduring. Even now, centuries later, the echoes are everywhere. Towns built on maps drawn by explorers. Borders established where a line was drawn in a notebook. Economies shaped by trade routes imagined and enforced by men who were restless. And the restlessness continues, not as ships and sails, but as ideas, infrastructure, and systems that keep moving forward without asking permission. If you close your eyes now, imagine it. A single footprint in sand, another beside it, and more. A trail stretching to the horizon, always forward. No one left to see it except the wind and time. That's the quietest kind of danger. The one that doesn't shout, doesn't threaten, just shifts the world a little at a time. So, as your thoughts drift gently along with these stories, let the motion stop. No more ships, no more flags, no more explorers, just stillness. A world that continues quietly, and you here resting in it. Good night. Art 12. The final drift. Letting history rest. Alright, this is the very last part. No excitement, no new names, no fresh voyages. Just the gentle conclusion. The part where we let everything settle, like sediment at the bottom of a calm river. By now, the footsteps of explorers have faded. The ships have rotted in harbors or sunk in oceans. The flags have bleached in the sun. The maps have been folded, filed, and forgotten in dusty archives. And yet, the world has not returned to emptiness. It has simply carried on, quietly reshaped by those restless people who once insisted on moving. Think about it. Every movement leaves a mark. Every first has a ripple. Every decision, however small, bends the shape of what comes next. Even if the explorers themselves are long gone. Even if the journals have yellowed to dust. Even if no one remembers the exact date a ship left a port. Their influence remains. Subtle, almost invisible, but undeniable. This is the final lesson of dangerous exploration. It is not about courage or recklessness. It is not about glory or conquest. It is about motion. About a refusal to stop. About the quiet, cumulative effect of moving forward without pause. And the way the world reshapes itself in response. Now close your eyes and drift with it. Imagine. Calm seas. Empty except for gentle ripples. Deserts stretching, unbroken by footprints. Ice plains still, reflecting pale skies. Forests breathing quietly after centuries of passage. The world is there, waiting, unhurried. And you are there too. Breathing, unrushed. Not required to explore, conquer, or record. The greatest danger of explorers is no longer present. It was in motion itself. And now, for tonight, motion is optional. Let it rest. Let the maps close. Let the compasses stop spinning. Let the journals lie quietly on their shelves. Because the world doesn't need anyone to keep proving it exists. Listen to the quiet. Feel the pause. Everything that needed to move has moved. Everything that needed to be learned has been noted. And now, there is only the gentle hum of time. Steady, patient, and endless. Good night. The explorers have left. The footsteps are gone. And the world waits for the next story. Tomorrow. Part 13. The endless echo of footsteps never taken. Alright. If you're still listening, this is the very softest layer of history. The part that isn't about ships, maps, or famous names. It's about absence. And what happens when even the most restless footsteps finally stop. By now, all the explorers we've met are quiet. Their journals, flags, and ships are gone or faded. And yet, something remains. Not in monuments, not in textbooks, but in the spaces they once moved through. Think of a coastline. It exists whether anyone has walked along it or not. A forest grows regardless of who charts it. A river flows even if no one measures its length. Explorers were dangerous because they believed that movement created reality. But reality has a stubborn independence. Persists. It resists. It quietly endures. And that's the final soft lesson. Sometimes the greatest impact is not in moving forward. Not in claiming. Not in discovering. Sometimes it is in what happens after the footsteps fade. The quiet continuity of the world. The patience of nature. The endurance of places untouched by ambition. So, if your mind still drifts, imagine an empty ship gently rocking in calm waters. A trail of footprints that slowly erases itself in wind or snow. Mountains and deserts that remain unchanged despite centuries of human desire to map and conquer. And the soft, steady rhythm of the world going on without intervention. Explorers changed the world. But the world is bigger than any of them. Stronger. More patient. And infinitely quieter when you finally stop listening. This is the pause beyond maps. The stillness beyond motion. The gentle closure after centuries of restless ambition. Let it settle. Let it breathe. Let it be. Good night. And this time, let it truly be the end.